Hi, everyone. I am Tracy Potts, the Executive Director of the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College, and we are hosting this webinar tonight because if you're like me and you are really into politics and you were really into this election, you may have some questions at this point about where we're headed. And so our conversation tonight is midterm elections. What's next for Congress, America, and democracy. And we intentionally wanted to take a larger look than just these midterm elections. I think that is certainly our touch point for tonight. There's still lots of questions, lots of races that are undecided. But we also have larger questions about what happened last night and what's continuing to happen in terms of the vote count, and what this means not only for control of the Senate, control of Congress, but what it means for people being civically engaged in our country and how we've gotten to this point. And we've been talking a lot about polarization. And so we have so much to talk about with my colleagues here tonight. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Bruce Larson of the Political Science Department at Gettysburg College. Bruce does a number of things, but one of the things that he does is teach a class on the U.S. Congress. And so this is a pretty exciting night for you, exciting week for you, Bruce. I know I've been in your class a couple of times. We've had some great conversations, and I hope to do more of that tonight. And we also have joining us tonight, Matt Weil. Matt is the Executive Director of the Democracy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I like to emphasize that to people because it's important to know that there are times and places where we are working together and working across the aisle. And so, Matt, welcome to the conversation. And I'm pleased to welcome my former colleague and continuing to work in journalism as well, Domenico Montanaro. Domenico is a senior political editor and correspondent for NPR. We used to work together at another organization. And I know that you have some other commitments because when you ask a journalist to be part of this, sometimes they have to hop in and out a little bit. So I'm so glad that you're here, Domenico. Why don't we actually start with you? Give us a big picture from a journalist point of view, right? What you were looking for as these returns were coming in, what's at stake, what was important, and what surprised you and what didn't?
Well, I mean, I think we always have to keep an open mind in these elections going in that, whatever we're looking at might be best data available. But I think that sometimes the narrative can get out ahead of the data. And I think that can be potentially problematic. And I've been preaching patience for weeks. I've been saying that, these elections are likely to be very close. I haven't paid a ton of attention to horse race polls throughout the cycle because I mostly talk to the campaigns and to the people who are behind the campaigns and were telling me, yeah, Tim Ryan might be ahead right now. Don't pay attention to that. It doesn't mean it's not real, but it's going to happen. And that's because of the historical trends, the voter registration data, what they're seeing on the ground. All of that stuff is far more important. I think sometimes we get too wedded to data, and I think that's important to have a good mix of data and reporting on the ground. I think
right, don't make the story before the story happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think just sometimes you just got to be open to what could happen, and have let it wash over. It's so funny. People will often, the same people who say we shouldn't predict things, always ask me what's going to happen, and I say to them, just let it happen. We don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you can talk about the best available data. We certainly saw that Democrats had an enthusiasm spike post Dobbs, which was real. We saw that inflation was a top issue for a lot of people. That certainly was real. And we saw a closing of that gap, sometime around September or October, but it didn't necessarily translate or mean that this is the numbers of what's specifically going to happen or not. The Senate is exactly where I thought everything was going to be. I said, yeah, you might see Fetterman up, in some surveys, but I said, what the campaigns have been telling me is they expect it to be a 51-49 race. I believe where they're putting their money. And I'm prepared for, helping our reporters try to cover that story as to why it happened, who was fired up, who wasn't. I think that's our role more than anything in trying to be prognosticators. Obviously the House was an underperformance for Republicans. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of them, principally is just a lot of good Democratic incumbents who stood the test in a lot of these places. They were prepared. They had a lot of money. They ran good races. They debated well and were able to sort of withstand a bit of a wave. And, a lot of Republicans I've been hearing from blaming President Trump. Maybe they're ready to do that, to say that he picked some of the candidates who didn't necessarily do well in purple states and purple districts. And, all of those things as a confluence, plus the cross currents of abortion rights with what we see with a typical midterm, I think those things a little bit made for volatility that I think we had to be prepared for something that was maybe unusual for a midterm.
Yeah. Let me ask you one or two more questions, and then I want Bruce to hop in, because I have a feeling that Bruce is jumping off his seat. He and I spent a lot of time talking about Congress and the makeup of Congress. But number one, you're a journalist, right? So after the fact, you have to have a headline. You have to have a story the next day. What's the big takeaway from last night, even considering the fact that we are still awaiting a number of races? What's the headline? What's the takeaway? And also, well, let's just start with that.
I had 6 takeaways. You can read them at npr.org. Although I tell that to my parents and they don't even go read them. So I understand. Obviously, the Senate's undecided. It's going to go on a while. I think the underperformance in the House was a big deal and a thing that going forward, people are going to be picking apart, talking about Kevin McCarthy's ability to be speaker. Is there a challenge? Right now we're hearing not. But, I think sometimes challenges can come not from the person who says they're going to be challenging, but from the people who push somebody else to become that challenge. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth on what happens in Congress about that. What's his governing majority going to be? I mean, just in the estimates I'm trying to do, and literally before I came on, this is my model. This is, it's not much of a model. It's the Democratic flips.
You're high tech there.
What's what? My high tech stuff. You might remember how high tech I was with all my. I think writing it down is a good thing. Anyway, we're looking at maybe range of 7 to 13 net pickups for Republicans. That's not a huge governing majority, especially since you're hearing about a lot of Republicans on the right saying that they're going to push Kevin McCarthy with some of their policy initiatives. We know that the 40 or so Freedom Caucus members back in the Boehner days wound up essentially kicking him out of Congress because he couldn't govern them. So that's going to be a huge thing that we wind up talking about. And, look, we're not going to know the Senate for a while. I mean, we're not going to, Arizona's not going to finish their counting until at least Friday. Even in that case, Georgia's headed to a runoff. So we're kind of where we thought we might be. Yeah.
Interesting. So Bruce, let me pull you in. I know that you have got to go back into the classroom and talk to your students next week about what's happened here. What's your takeaway? What's your big takeaway in terms of what this means going forward?
Well, actually, and if I could also, Tracy, just jump back onto a few things that Domenico said.
Yeah.
And I will tell my students these things too. Polls are challenging these days. There's so many of them. They're harder to do. It's harder to get a sample. There's more, and one of the things I tell my students is that polls are estimates. There's a margin of error. In one respect, they're the least useful the closer the race, right? Because
and let me hop in and just give you this thought as well. Polls tell us the responses of people who answer polls, right? There are lots of people out there who vote who either aren't caught in polls or specifically don't want to be part of polls, right? And so that's a big missing piece of the puzzle.
You bet.
I would just jump in to just say, in defense of polls a little bit here, they've done a lot of really good work in the past few years to figure this out. And they were really, really good, actually, in this election. So I think one of the problems is the narrative and the ability to tell people and to have journalists correctly interpret them to say these are not only snapshots, but they have their ranges, there's estimates. Yeah. And when something's showing you a race that's 51-47 a few days before an election, that's a tied race. Yeah, and that's how it should be talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And also contextualizing these, right? Like people were talking to me and saying, look, this is tightening up. Well, polls tighten up before every election as you move in past Labor Day, right? That's a common thing to happen. So contextualizing polls as well. And never, I always, I kind of encourage my students not to look at one poll, right? Look at trends. It's like the stock market. You don't follow the little ups and downs, but look at trends. Where are things going and so on. But polls are different. I mean, some are registered voters, some are screening out likely voters. Those are tough to get. The screening questions themselves can be problematic and challenging. Just a couple of other points on this. I totally agree. The point about strong Democratic candidates. I'm thinking about somebody like Abigail Spanberger, who's a tough and had a new district, faced a very tough challenger, and was able to pull this race out. Hertz was one of the first I was looking for. I was thinking, if this race goes to Democrats, it might not be as bad of a night as people were thinking. And I guess the last thing I would say, and I'm bringing this back to the classroom, and in a way, I'm guilty of this, which is why I want to say it, because I kind of love data. And I look at, I show trends about midterm losses in elections, right, in midterm elections for the president's party, and history constrains us, and so my default is, well, this is going to be a tough election for Democrats. They didn't start with big majorities in the first place, right? So it's going to be a challenging election. But politics changes, and history is constraining maybe, but not deterministic. And so it is, as you all are saying, it's important to keep an open mind here and not fall into this narrative right away. And certainly if candidates did, they wouldn't continue to fight. They think they're going to win. They go out to the last minute on these races. I've seen candidates working right up until, late on Monday night.
Which is interesting, because one of the things I was looking at last night were the huge number of people, voters, who said they made up their minds before the last week. And so you see this big rush of advertising and of candidates getting out there. But a lot of people have, 45 million of them had already voted before by the middle of the day on election day. And then of those who voted, 90% said, yeah, I didn't make up my mind in the last week. So interesting. Matt, I want to pull you in here because part of the Democracy Project, you have several different projects under that program. One looking at structural democracy, right? So I don't know if polls are part of that, but weigh in here on the kind of the big picture of what this tells us.
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Tracy, for inviting me. Thank you to the Eisenhower Institute and to Gettysburg. So I guess I'm the kind of out person on this one, because I don't really follow the horse race, right? I don't do the politics for the most part. And my background is the machinery of elections, the policies around it, the structural democracy, how we're voting, whether you're doing a regular kind of primary, is it open, is it closed, is it top 5, top 4? And my initial takeaway of last night was it was pretty boring, and I'm okay with that, because in 2020, I can tell you it was not boring. It was terrifying, right? We saw people literally outside counting sites trying to get in because they thought they were being denied entry, which they did not have access to. But we thought we were going to see more of that, right? But every indication was that we were going to see what we've been calling the insider threat. Poll workers who became poll workers, but were really, closet partisans, and were intending to be citizen journalists inside the polling place, inside the counting sites, to be disruptive, right? That didn't materialize. And for the most part, we actually didn't see many breakdowns of the system, right? We saw a little bit of a problem in Maricopa County. It was resolved. Had it happened in any other site, it probably would have been a non-issue, but it happened in Maricopa County, and Maricopa County over the past 2 years has been ground zero for election craziness. So that happened. But we also saw the regular things that we always see. Some jurisdictions ran out of paper ballots. Some of the poll books weren't allowing voters to check in at the beginning of the polling day because the time change last weekend meant that the poll books thought it was a different time, couldn't start. So we have problems. Nothing was determinative. So to me, my takeaway at least was our system was always resilient. It was tested in 2020. We've fortified it since then, and it certainly held last night, which I think was very important.
Right,
Okay,
we
so
didn't see
that's
those long lines that we saw, of people 4 hours later trying to get in. So if the story is about whether elections work, whether elections allow people to be civically engaged, it was a much better story now than it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, look, it's better in nearly every state right now than it has ever been to vote. I say that, and I say that with complete confidence because 20 years ago, the vast majority of states did not have no excuse absentee voting. They did not have early voting. You had to, unless you had a reason to vote absentee, you had to go to the polls on election day. And the trends are very clear. I mean, you mentioned them, 45 million voters casting ballots this time before election day, but the trends have been clear irrespective of what happened, 2 years ago, and we obviously saw a huge spike in absentee voting, that voters want convenience options. And almost every state, blue, red, purple, has provided those. And that's good. There's some challenges to it. And the challenges are the ones that we're seeing now that probably keep Domenico up at night because it delays the counting, right? If you have a lot more absentee ballots, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, well, it takes more time to count them. So you just don't have as much unofficial results on election night. That's not a problem. It's not a problem in the system. What we learned in 2020 the hard way is that delta between election day and the close of polls and the releasing of pretty good unofficial results, that's where you get the misinformation, the disinformation campaigns can really kind of pick up steam. And so we have to deal with that. And there are ways to do it, but that's the new policy question that I think policymakers, Pennsylvania and around the country need to be wrestling with to avoid the problems that we can avoid.
Yeah, what I hear you saying is, elections are becoming almost a slow burn now. Like we knew going in, and we now know the day after that we're not going to know all of the results. And not only are we not going to know them all, we're not going to know some of the key results. But we know that, and we expect that. And I think what I hear you saying is that's the trade-off for democracy, is the working better. It's the trade-off for allowing more people to be able to vote in ways that are more equitable, in ways that are more fair, in ways that get more people to turn out to vote. It means the process takes a little longer.
And it's absolutely true. And it does make it more equitable. It makes it much easier for voters who do not have flexibility in their work schedules to find a time that works for them. Almost every state has some sort of early voting option that includes weekend days. And yes, it does delay results, but you look at Pennsylvania, for example, obviously this time the race was called pretty early, but in 2020, it was not. Pennsylvania has done some good work to expand access to voting by mail. What they didn't do is they didn't make it easier to count those ballots. They didn't do the second half of the policy. And that's not an unavoidable thing. They could have done that. And so we really should focus on both things, make it more accessible and then make the count easier so we don't have these after election day time periods where you can kind of let the disinformation flourish.
So it's a process. We're getting there. Domenico, I was thinking about when he was saying, the fact that more people can vote and it's easier for people to vote makes it more difficult for journalists to have all the pieces in place, so to speak, to tell the story quickly afterwards. We just, we have to wait that process out. I don't know if you have a connection to Pennsylvania. Matt, I know you do. You went to school in Pennsylvania. Bruce, you're coming to us from Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Was anybody surprised that Pennsylvania went blue so quickly?
I think as quickly as it did, yes. I wasn't surprised. I wouldn't have been surprised if it was 51-49 Fetterman or 51-49 Oz, frankly. I thought that was totally possible. The scenario in which it would go to Oz is if it was, late deciders just all broke in the Republicans' direction, which is not unusual for a party out of power. So where the enthusiasm was pointing to, certainly potentially it could have been something like that, but I wouldn't have been surprised seeing what happened. I was a little surprised it was as early as it was.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a minor thing. I think the bigger picture point here about voting and disinformation and the potential problems at the polls is really expectation setting for our audience, because I think that people are so used to, and networks have gotten so good on their decision desks at projecting races when 0% of the vote is in because of exit polls, because of key precincts and all of that, that people like Trump expect to see results on election night because that's good TV, man. Like, he likes that. He sees it. He wants that to be the result. It's usually the result. What's going on with this funny business if it's not? I mean, that really shows a complete lack of education and understanding about what the election, well, how election counting actually goes, what certified votes mean. The data that gets released early is unofficial counts for the most part. And I feel like over the last 2 years, we knew heading into 2020 that there would be this problem, and we tried and, educate people as much as we could. But throughout this cycle, at any chance I really could, and why we have an entire voting team, I have an entire democracy team, I have an entire disinformation team, that we try to explain how to pull the veil back on how things go in these places, and the kinds of, so to sort of make it less able to be, conspiracy prone, which so many people did in really unethical ways, starting with Trump.
One of the things that I had spent a lot of time doing when I was in the newsroom, and even more so now, is really talking about that. Journalists and the media as a whole, really kind of showing people how the sausage is made, in part because it's part of our role. It's part of the reporting, but also to build and rebuild trust in the system. I mean, you talked, Matt, about one of your projects being structures of democracy. I think, as particularly when we see the influence of mis and disinformation now, the media is a big part of that structure, and people need to understand how it works. Domenico, you brought up, so since you brought it up, I'm gonna see if maybe you can be a little bit of the educator here for a moment. I'm not sure that everyone who is watching or listening gets this, as sort of we politicos, people who follow this, might, how it is that races can be called when so little of the vote is in. What's happening? Help people understand what's happening behind the scenes.
Sure. I've been answering this question since I first started covering politics. So for the better part of 20 years, the last, to try to figure it out myself, frankly, at the beginning of it, when I was a researcher or associate producer at CBS and writing the first briefing books that I did in their polling unit. And, you figure out that the decision desks at these networks with statisticians are very, very good at their jobs. They are able to look at historical data and trends. They are able to, these exit polls that are conducted, which aren't just exit polls anymore. Now they are entrance polls, they're pre-election polls, they're calling people. They're just like regular polls, but they're calling a lot of people, right? You see a margin of error for a regular poll is 3.5%, over 1,000 people usually. That's a good national poll. If you look at the number of people that are surveyed in the exit polls and in the vote cast now from AP, it is tens of thousands of people, and maybe 3,000 to 4,000 in a state. Those are really small margins of errors and really good samples. The problem with them is sometimes you don't know who you're getting, and they're right, the exit polls, which is that they force the data or they weight the data to the final results based on what they have. So that's why through the night you'll see changes in it. But if you know, for example, that this particular county is the largest vote share for a particular party, and that and the exit poll data that's coming in shows that that's incumbent senator winning that area by over the margin that they've gotten in past elections, and that's happening in 3 or 4 different key places in the state, and it's somebody who's expected to win, a John Bozeman in Arkansas, right? You can call that right at poll close time with a pretty good sense that that's going to go that direction. And it's why it takes longer, because they're sort of constantly shifting through the night for those more closely followed races, and why sometimes they can't call it on election night and it winds up going to the certified results. We're going to see that for quite some time with these closer races. It sounds like a lot of hokum, but I promise you there's a lot of science behind it that has taken decades of work by a lot of really smart people.
Bruce, I see you nodding. You trust this map? You trust this
Oh,
map?
absolutely. Domenico is exactly right on that. And again, the wider the margin, the faster you can call it. And I'm thinking last night about Wes Moore's victory in Maryland, right? That was a pretty assured victory. At the time, the polls closed in Maryland. Shortly thereafter, there was just no way for Cox to make up the differences in the rest of the states, and statisticians had computed that. So it was really safe to actually call that race as early as it does. But I think a lot of people wonder, why can we call this race now, but we can't call other races then? But again, it's a function of a lot of things. But yeah, I trust the projectors on. There are estimates. Sometimes they get it wrong. I remember watching in 2000 when they retracted Florida for Gore, right? And it changed the course of the election. These again are estimates. They are wrong sometimes, but by and large, they're right and they're good.
And it changed the course of how the networks did their jobs. Mm-hmm. And that means if you're hearing a call today, they are really dang sure at poll close if they're making that call, which is why, frankly, I think who knows how this works, but also most people across the country, when they heard a poll close call for Ron DeSantis, it was like, oh, that must be a humongous margin. And that's a shocker, right? And I think, and it did, it wound up being a very large margin. That's why they were able to call it at poll close. That was an indicator immediately, right? And I was live on the air when this happened. I looked at my colleague, Sue Davis, who's been covering this even a little longer than I have. And we were like, Florida's gone as a potential Democratic state. Like, it is now gone the way of an Ohio. And it is essentially a red state that Democrats are probably going to have a really hard time ever picking up again. I heard a Democratic strategist say today that they have a better chance at picking up Texas than they do Florida from here on out. And I think that people need to understand that political maps are changeable. Politics is not static. I just want people to understand, between 1968 and 1992, California went Republican in every single presidential election until Bill Clinton won it in 1992. Like, for people now, that's got to be mind-blowing, right? Yeah. And Florida, people have to realize Democrats have not won a gubernatorial race there since 1994 when Lawton Childs did. It's almost 30 years at this point. So, things change. And as the sun is rising for Democrats in the Sun Belt in places like Georgia and maybe Texas, but definitely Arizona, it's maybe setting in Florida.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about kind of that big picture season of change, because as fast as Pennsylvania went blue, Florida went red. You mentioned Bush Gore. I was with a group of about a dozen Gen Z college students. We were in DC last night. We did an election night watch party. We had a couple of folks come in, including Matt's colleague, Grace Gordon, who talked about voting in elections. She was fantastic. And we ended up in a conversation about hanging chads. And this is a thing of the past, and a couple, it was cute. Some of my students were like, what? And one of my students was physically trying to describe hanging chads, which you talked about being terrified, Matt, at the last election. I definitely hope that we're not going back ever in that direction again. Many of my colleagues spent a nice month in Florida as we were trying to figure out where democracy was going that year.
So on eBay, I was able to buy my own punch card voting machine, Tracy. So in my office in DC, I have one of the data vote punch cards. So if your students ever want to see one, they can make their own chads now.
We might have to do that. We might actually have to do that. Look, I wanted to ask you, Matt, I know of all of the projects that you oversee. You talked about digital democracy. Talk to me a little bit about that. We've been talking about math, we've been talking about tech and how we, how we game these things out. Talk to me a little bit about another tech issue, which is digital democracy, and what does that mean as we are increasingly in a country where people are getting their information faster and getting their information in very different ways?
So it's a great question. And we know that there's some variation in how voters get information. We certainly know that most younger voters are getting that information from tech platforms. Right now, that's TikTok, which is maybe not the best tech platform, but that's the reality. But other social medias too, right? So Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat are all where people are getting what they believe to be actual hard news from. And that's a reality. And so what we're doing on the digital democracy project is to try to find ways to get authoritative information between election officials, who are still the most trusted sources of information for voters of any age, to voters. And that comes in different ways, right? We do know that there's a lot of information flowing through these tech platforms, and the way you get your message amplified is getting many more followers, right? And the problem is, anybody with a following can say whatever they want, and there's very little fact checking that happens. And the people who know, the election officials, often can't get those kind of followings. It's not their job. Their job is to run elections. Their job is to register voters. And so there's a disconnect between the loudest voices and the most authoritative voices. And so platforms have options, right? They can raise up the profiles of the election officials. They can fact check in real time. If you go back to 2020, both Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they had labels on different posts. So if a post was flagged as potentially not true, the person reading that would at least understand that was a challenged post. They didn't do that as much in this election, though. And so working through the platforms and their internal policies for how they might get better information, I think is the next frontier, because right now I don't see Congress creating guardrails for what the tech platforms are going to do. I think tech policy is likely to be a big issue, both for House Republicans if they take the House, and even Senate Democrats if they keep the Senate. But I don't see them agreeing. So I don't see new legislation happening and getting signed into law before 2024. And so the policies, the internal policies that the platforms make for how democracy plays out on their platforms become de facto law. And we don't want to ignore that part of the process.
It is so important, as we think about making democracy work and making it work well, that people get accurate information. One of when we were with the student group last night, the whole beginning of our evening started out talking about social media and the use of social media by legacy organizations, right? So not just influencers, not just people who are just kind of randomly putting information out there, not even disinformation, but we were talking about the use of social media by traditional legacy news organizations. I remember when I was working for one, this was, kind of years ago, we kind of started out, I'm a broadcaster and that's all I do. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait, we have to do some social media. How's this going to work? And I distinctly remember getting a corporate memo at one point that essentially said something like, social media is out there. We know it's really important. We're not quite sure yet what we want to do with it, but you guys go out there and tweet and post, make sure it's accurate, remember who you work for, and we're going to figure this thing out. And we've come so far from there. Domenico, how do you see the use of social media really kind of influencing the information that people are getting during elections, and not just kind of like, I think Twitter, and there's a whole lot we can say about Twitter right now and where it's going, but I think for people on Capitol Hill, for people in Washington, it's a big source of getting information and getting information out. But even like TikTok, like the Washington Post has really kind of harnessed this. I'd use that as an example because every time I'm on like Instagram, I mean, they really have seemed to have figured out how to get their message out and how to draw people in. What's happening in your newsroom, and what's the conversation around that?
Boy, there's so much to talk about. It's an entire course. But just trying to be brief on that, I think it's a double-edged sword in some respects, right? But I think that we have to, as journalists, always remember that the way people consume information changes through the years, and we need to be present in the places where our audience is. So when people always talk about, at TV organizations, how do we get this kind of viewer to watch our show? Or how do I at NPR, get these types of people to listen to this show? And it's a little bit the reverse in the way we should be thinking about it and are in some respects thinking about it. You have to be where people are. So, NPR was at the vanguard on podcasting, and, a lot of people within the terrestrial radio world were a little threatened by that and didn't want to see that be the thing that overtook radio or any of that, or siphoned away, listeners from the radio. That's just not how it works. All right. I mean, what we found in our data is that 70% of the people who listen to the NPR Politics podcast are under 35 years old. Most of them, almost all of them, have never listened to NPR on the radio. So it's an opportunity as a vehicle to bring people in. I really think that there's always going to be the necessity for information, good, valid, accurate information. It's just going to depend on how we slice it up and where we put it and how it's presented to people and how they want to get that information. I think where social media tends to be a problem sometimes is when people get wedded to speed and their own vanity of their own personality, that they want so badly to be out there and to be out there quickly that they're not adhering to the standards and guidelines and ethics of what we would do in the medium of the traditional medium. So it's a thing people always ask me, how are you different on All Things Considered versus on the NPR Politics podcast? And I say, I'm really not, except for the fact that I've got 3.5 minutes, so I got to be tighter with what I talk about. And on the podcast, I can be a little looser, but that doesn't mean loose as far as my journalistic integrity. I mean, I think that's a thing that I think a lot of, in particular, younger people who are coming up in the business, I think really need to, I feel like, for their own sakes, be able to adhere to some of those traditional ethical standards, to be able to say, okay, let me think before I tweet. Let me, I want a voice and I want a social media platform, but I also need to represent my company. I mean, I think, it's a different generation thing. If NPR asked me to wear a marching band outfit every day, I would, because they pay me, right? But other people would be like throwing a fit and still want to work there. It's just a different way to think about it. And I think social media has opened up everybody's opportunity and ability to be a thing, to be a person, to be seen and heard. And I think some of that we got to be careful about, because it can dilute the quality of what we do, and it can really throw a lot of noise in where things are. And disinformation has been able to flourish. Anybody who wants a link to their own pre-existing held belief can find it now, and it doesn't mean that link to santamonica.gazette.net is the same as newyorktimes.com, and unfortunately for a lot of people it is.
Right. It's you said something that's near and dear to my heart. I've spent about the last 10, 12 years working with the News Literacy Project, initially going into classrooms, then on a digital platform, now really on a larger platform beyond students to help the public and help the audience understand our role. So there's the role of journalists in making sure that we are sharing accurate information, even though we may be doing it in different places. I love what you said. We need to be present in the places where our audience is, where people are. But we also now have a role as members of the public, as individuals, to kind of help train and teach people where to find accurate information. Like, how do you vet your sources of news? You know where you're getting stuff from, you know what's crossing your phone. How do you know that's accurate? And so I spend a lot of time talking to people about how do you as an individual vet those sources. You talked about journalistic integrity. Good news sources are upfront about that, right? News organizations are upfront about that. This is how we source things. This is how we double source. If you hear something, we have standards about, pretty high standards about how we I still say we, I'm still a journalist at heart, right? How we give you information, right? We vet that information and we are transparent about how we do so, who are considered credible sources. And I think individuals have to take a look at the organizations where they're getting their news from. And if they're not being transparent about that, you have to wonder, are they, giving you accurate information? Bruce, you work with students all the time, all day long. Where are they getting their information from? And I've been in your class a few times now. You have great conversations and you have really smart students. But where are they getting their information from? Do you guys ever talk about that?
Well, I think first of all, it's all over the place. I had a student say to me once, I just get these headlines on my phone and I just slip them over and I get a lot of my news that way. And I said, well, what's the source? He wasn't actually sure about the source. It's literally all over the place, I think, because there are so many more options. I just wanted to, and since you all are in media and Tracy used to be though, I'm not sure. We have so many more venues and avenues for getting information now. It's not at all clear to me that people are better informed, younger people, older people, at all. And I'd love to see data on that. For example, there's lots of questions on, the extent to which people know their House members, and those data haven't changed at all. And I wonder, it's because regardless of where you're getting your information from, people select themselves into it. Like the people who go to NPR podcasts, right? They are looking for politics somewhere. But I think what this incredibly diverse array of sort of media choice has done is it's given people more ways to opt out, right? And if you wanted to watch TV at 6 o'clock in 1970, you basically had to watch the 6 o'clock news, right? There wasn't a way to opt out. Now, once we had cable, there's ESPN. And what happens, I think, is when people opt out, the people that are left tend to be more partisan, right? And so it's not clear to me that just because we have all of this new digital infrastructure for getting people information, that's actually paying dividends. And so I'm kind of ending with a question: how do we pull in more people? You know what I mean? How do we make it attractive? And that's a difficult thing to do. And I'm not sure the answer lies in social media.
Yeah, no, I think that we're in an a la carte, society where people are picking and choosing, whether they want the orange or they want the grapes or they want the meat, and they don't ever have to eat an orange because there's just a whole cart of red meat, right? So why go for the vegetables, right? When, maybe in the past, we're never going to be at a point again where a president would say, oh, I've lost Uncle Walter, then I've lost the country, as referring to Walter Cronkite for the Vietnam War. And, that's just not where we're at. And we're never going to go back to that. And, one of my pastimes is cooking. I really enjoy cooking. Maybe it was the pandemic that supercharged that. But I was watching an episode of this guy who went out to Arizona, where apparently he claims is the best pizza in the United States, not New York, not New Jersey, whatever. The caveat is this guy is, got roots in Italy and all of that and just moved to Arizona. But when everybody who ate it, including the New York Times reviewer, said, God, this really is the best pizza I've ever had. And they interviewed the guy. It's pizza, right? It's dough, it's, it's sauce and it's cheese. Like, how much goes into that, right? And he said, look, and I'm not going to use the words he used. He said, look, what goes into that oven is what comes out. Crap in, crap out, right? And I think that that's a lot of our media landscape. You can have as much of it as you want, but a jumbo slice in DC ain't that, pizza that was, grown with the grain in the fields of Arizona, with the tomatoes that were shipped in from Italy and the basil that's grown in his backyard. It's not the same thing. And the problem is the prevalence of all of these things doesn't necessarily mean that there's quality. So I think that, your point, Tracy, about news literacy is a great one. It's one I ran into when I taught high school English for 3 years, and teaching 14-year-olds that Wikipedia is not necessarily, the source to use for your book report, or maybe, use the link at the bottom, and read that, like getting people to go that extra intellectual step to like look for primary source information is difficult. So to be able to then have them say, oh, that link that you clicked on, that's actually not a great source. This one's a better source. It's very difficult to do, but I think it's necessary.
It's hard work. And if I could just jump on that just for a second, and some of my students are incredibly well informed. They read, I feel like they read less and want to read shorter things. So they do more podcasts. They do, more YouTube and so on. So I think in the classroom, you have to bring more of that to them too. They're just not used to reading as much, and they're used to smaller snippets of information, I think.
Matt, as you kind of look at the big picture of strengthening democracy and democratic institutions and the role of media and the role of information in that, do you have any thoughts on this whole society where we are, doing things at what it used to be 140 characters, now it's 200 and something, I don't know, but where people are getting smaller snippets, and sometimes it seems like there's more focus on the format in which the information is being delivered than the quality and the substance of the information itself. I wonder, it's just kind of to me, a big picture issue that really, if we don't have an informed electorate, it's going to be really a well-informed electorate. It's really hard to make the wheels turn the way they should. I just wonder if that's something that greasing those wheels and making sure that people are well-informed, something that's part of the big picture work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily part of the big picture work that I do. I think it's important. I think for sure people knew, who took the time to vote yesterday knew what was at the top of their ticket. And that's fine if you're living in maybe Northern Virginia, where all you were voting on yesterday was literally one House race, didn't have anything else on the ballot, one race on the ballot. I live in Maryland, and I had two-page ballot, double-sided. Did I know who the judges for the orphans court were? No, I didn't really know. I'm a fairly well-informed voter, right? So that's one problem. We vote on a lot of things here, and getting very local information is very difficult. The other problem, and while I think the media is getting better, there isn't a lot of focus on elections outside of, the month or two, like the operations of elections, the month or two outside of voting, right? And even until recently, and even still, the media doesn't participate always in educating the public in the ways I think the people who do the voting would like them to. Since I've been in the field, and that's 18 years now, every election jurisdiction does what's called logic and accuracy testing on their voting machines. It's an open period. They do it in the public. They check the machines to make sure they're recording accurately, they're counting accurately. And they invite the parties to be there, the candidates to be there, the media. Almost never is there an audience for it. So if there's really such belief that the system is so flawed and rigged, even 2 years on of the narrative that there's so many problems, people still aren't going to the logic and accuracy testing. They're not observing the audits that are happening starting in the next week or two. And so, yes, I do think we need to be more informed, but I think we all have limitations on how much we can inform ourselves. And so we do need somebody like the media to try to funnel that information to the voters for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, we have a question. Loving this conversation. Thank you very much. So am I. As our sources of information become more siloed and partisan, where can we find or build a better shared understanding of democracy? It's a good question. I mean, do we even all agree what democracy is?
I can't speak for my fellow panelists here, but no, I think it's hard, right? We talked about this earlier, Tracy. Democracy also means coming together to talk about the hard questions that need to be talked about. And you can't do that from your silo. I think we certainly have, I work in DC for 18 years. There's certainly Democrats that are very confident talking to a bunch of other Democrats, maybe to the left of them or to the right of them. Then you have your Republicans on the other side, and they talk to themselves. And yeah, it's really hard to get to the more difficult conversations because it's uncomfortable. I work at the Bipartisan Policy Center. This is what we do, right? We bring people together from both sides to actually have some difficult conversations. Is that easy to replicate in the general public? Probably not. But I do think universities is one place where I hope people come with different points of view and they can reconcile them. They can talk openly on campus in class to either strengthen their own beliefs or to maybe be pushed off their beliefs. But as you get older, as you kind of self-segregate into living in communities that look like you marry people who tend to have the same beliefs, you go to church or synagogue with the people who tend to vote like you. We are self-segregated, and if we're going to be a vibrant democracy, we're going to have to do the harder conversations. We're going to have to create space to do that, and that's really complicated in a country that has basically neglected civics education for the past 3 or 4 decades. Like it's not going to happen organically. It needs to happen deliberately, and I don't know how to do that yet.
Wow. Yeah, I want to remind people also that you can submit questions via our Q&A feature. Last night when we were with the students, one of our presenters showed what I thought were some, we talked about data earlier, some fascinating data and graphs that not only showed the polarization, political polarization, right? We've seen that. We've talked about it ad nauseum, right? The country is pulling further apart, but also interesting to me showed the gaps in what Democrats and Republicans, this looks specifically at those parties, thought about each other, and the growing gaps of, what Democrats think about Republicans and Republicans say, no, that's not what I'm about at all. And vice versa, the same for the other side. That gap is growing. So it's not even just that we're kind of pulling apart, we also just don't understand each other very much. Our understanding of each other is inaccurate. And that to me is kind of scary and getting toward dangerous.
Well, since we're in a forum of university students and the university community, I'll note that I think the data you're citing also shows that the more educated you are, the worse the opinion you hold of people on the other side of the political aisle. So education, in some ways, makes you more polarized, and that's a tough thing to swallow.
I've seen that too, Matt, that actually education also makes you a better rationalizer of things you already believe in. You know what I mean? So it's not like, it's interesting, there's been some research on climate change denying, and you would think that it would be negatively correlated with education, but it's not, because people become better rationalizers when they're smarter. And it's kind of just alarming because for people who want to believe, like me, that education can fix things, and I still think it can, it's not always as straightforward, as clear as we'd like it to be.
Domenico, help me out as a journalist, and I try to tell people this all the time. Having worked in a newsroom for 30 years before I switched to the other side, so to speak. There are a lot of journalists out there who every single day are working very hard to put fair and accurate and balanced and contextualized, nuanced information out there for people. I also found that it was quite a challenge because our audience has changed, right? You were talking about the 6 p.m. Cronkite days, Bruce. Back then, people kind of wanted to hear what was going on. They wanted to hear the news down the middle, so to speak. Now, people are really seeking information, that confirmation bias, right? People are seeking information that confirms what they already believe. How challenging is it for you, or do you even think about this as you're trying to get accurate information out there, as you're trying to get balanced information out there, that there's a big chunk of our audience that's not looking for that anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it probably every day, because I think that there's more pressure on us to be right. And because I think that if somebody's giving us a chance, I think a lot of people are very skeptical of the work that we do. And if we have any chance of winning over people to understand that we're doing our best to do our job correctly and to give accurate information, that if they see something where they say, aha, see, I knew that you were really whatever, right? Whatever their own thing that they're looking for, if you sort of, play into that in any way, it can make it really difficult to retain those people who I think most need to hear things that they might not necessarily agree with. So you have to be really well sourced with your stories. Now, I feel like, during the Trump years, you would have never, even Woodward and Bernstein only had 2 sources, for goodness sake. How many Washington Post stories would you see? 17 national security sources at 17. Like, I've never seen that for a story, you know what I mean? And it was a real thing during the Trump years. And then people still said that it was fake news. To me, there's something really broken there when people can't even, trust something that is as well sourced as something like that. So it can be very disheartening and very, very dispiriting to see that landscape, to face that every day. But I think, if you just sort of let go and you realize, all right, I've just got to do my best here, do my job, be as transparent as possible, be able to be open and honest about my process, that you can only hope that people can, give you the benefit of the doubt as a human.
Yeah.
I would say a good book, since we're talking about people not reading, that might be one that helps with some of this and was a little in vogue probably 5-6 years ago, is The Big Sort, which sort of tells you a lot about where we are, the fact that people are talking only to their neighbors. They don't want their neighbors to be of a different political party. There's been a lot of polling actually that's shown people very upset, more upset than they have been in past years if their son or daughter were to marry somebody of a different political ideology. People really, really, really dug in on that stuff. And I think it puts us in a really precarious position because people are looking to fire away, no matter which side they are. I get it all around. So
yeah, I know.
It is what it
Look,
is.
we've got a couple of minutes left, and we actually have 2 really interesting questions. So right here at the end, I'm not sure if we'll get to them, but I'll throw them out there because I think they both make some interesting points. Along the lines of what we've been discussing, Gina says she worries that there is a disconnect about the motives and actions of politicians. I hear a lot of all politicians are corrupt as lawyers, and she says she's someone who ran for office. I know most people who run do so because they want to affect change. Sounds like us as journalists, right? We want to inform people. We may not always agree, but by and large, people enter politics with good intentions. How do we bridge the gap so people understand how hard it is that not all politicians are corrupt? Anybody want to address that one?
I'm going to say that
politician in the group.
Can I just say, well, and I don't want to blame all you media folks because I love what you do, but the good politicians, the workhorses, don't often get a lot of coverage, and the scandals do, and so people are always going to think. People watch the 6 o'clock news, and there's way more crime on it than actually happens. So people think there's more crime in the world, and so we don't. I think the media, and I don't know this as well as you guys do, but I think it's drawn to conflict. You cover plane crashes. You don't cover the 100,000 planes or 1 million planes that land safely every day. And I think that's true with elected officials too. So I think it's a challenge I think the best way, I always, well, not always, but often when I meet politicians, I'm like, wow, these are serious people. They put a lot of time into this. They do have convictions. They do work hard in many cases and are very persistent in their policy goals.
And I say this all the time: campaigning and governing are 2 different things.
You bet.
Right? And when you campaign well, you get a lot of attention for it. And when you govern well and things go well, sometimes you get a lot of attention for that, sometimes not.
I ask my students sometimes if they know who Henry Waxman is. You guys probably know. He was a Los Angeles, a California Democrat. He probably expanded Medicaid more than any single member of Congress, but he wasn't a guy who was always out there. He was a workhorse. He was a policy wonk. He was a legislator, and I worry that the legislators won't think they can achieve their goals in Congress anymore and will opt out. I hope that's not true, but I worry about that.
Yeah. Domenico, did you have a last thought?
Yeah, I mean,
you get the last word to wrap us up.
No,
Give us some hope.
I was just going to say, I mean, I don't think all politicians are corrupt. I think that it's a thing that we fight an uphill battle on. I mean, I grew up in an Italian household where my grandfather thought the Pope was responsible for all of the like crime and problems in the world. So, you know, I think skepticism of power is something that's deeply ingrained, especially in people who have, predilections toward populism and think that the system is against them. Right. I think that that's a thing that's very difficult to then convince people that actually, no, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump aren't exactly the same. Oh, do you see that now? Like, it's like going back to it. It's sort of like, yeah, like, do you think Hillary Clinton might have appointed different justices to the Supreme Court about issues you might care about? Like, this is an important thing of understanding the process. And I think that that's something that not a lot of people pay much attention to. They hear about the scandals, they hear about the bad things, they see all the money that's in politics and they think that it's bad and people are just all bad. And there are a lot of narcissists who run for office. I mean, it's hard not to find people who are when, your entire life has to be upended to run for office at the highest level, right? But most people are getting into politics because they want to make a difference. I was just a series that we did in 2016. It's called Journey Home, and I wanted to find out what drove people into politics, what made them tick, and where did they come from? And almost everybody had a reason for being, like a reason for getting involved, what the spur was to get there. And I hope people can find that sense of purpose. I mean, Joe Biden wrote about that in his book about getting over the death of his son, that like he had to have a sense of purpose. And I think that that's important for everybody. And I think that's why most politicians get into doing what they do.
Yeah. Domenico, you get the last word. Matt, Domenico, and Bruce, I really appreciate you spending this time with us tonight. Initially, really kind of talking about what we don't know yet, which is, what the future of Congress is going to look like, but all of these other larger issues that I know, Matt, you're going to spend a lot of time on to really look at where we're going in this country and what democracy looks like. Emma, I'm sorry we didn't get to your question. I'm glad you thought it was an interesting conversation. And I know you were concerned. She was asking about election deniers winning races and what does this mean for the political landscape going forward. I hope at the end there, Domenico gave you a little bit of hope that there are a lot of people who are getting into this for the right reasons. We appreciate you all spending this time with us tonight. We appreciate those of you who hung in there with us for this really interesting conversation. And don't let that be the end. Keep your eyes on EisenhowerInstitute.org, on our social media. We'll be letting you know when we're doing more pop-up live chats, usually on Instagram, sometimes on Facebook, and more webinars like this where we can have more in-depth conversations. So thank you guys. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.